Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Spalding. I am a senior advisor here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I lead the Defending Democratic Institutions project. We are really pleased today to be able to host this discussion, looking at Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. Today's discussion is going to focus on FISA in the context of our larger diplomatic efforts. Section 702 allows the government to conduct targeted surveillance of non-U.S. persons located outside the United States. When it was reauthorized in 2017, Congress included a sunset provision, and as a result of that, these authorities are set to expire at the end of this year unless Congress reauthorizes its use. Today's discussion is going to highlight this one aspect of 702, which is the ways in which the administration uses it to aid the diplomatic efforts of the U.S. and its partners and allies. In weeks to come, we plan to have additional programs on 702, looking at both the value of 702 in other contexts, but also looking at the discussions underway about ways to reform 702 to increase the public's confidence in its appropriate use. Today, we are honored to host Brett Holmgren, Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the U.S. State Department. Assistant Secretary Holmgren has served in this role since 2021. Prior to that, he served for 14 years in key leadership positions in the intelligence community, at the White House, and at the Department of Defense. During President Obama's administration, he served on the National Security Council staff as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Intelligence Programs. Following some opening remarks, Assistant Secretary Holmgren will be joined by our very own Glenn Gerstel, non-resident senior advisor here at CSIS in the International Security Program, for a fireside chat. Prior to joining CSIS, Glenn served as the General Counsel for the National Security Agency and Central Security Service from 2015 to 2020. Prior to that, he practiced law for almost 40 years at the international law firm of Milbank. Before turning it over to Assistant Secretary Holmgren, I want to note that we will be taking audience questions at the end of the program. If you're in the room, you've got the QR code up there, or if you're watching this online, you can find it, the CSIS question form, by clicking the Submit Questions button on the CSIS event page, and you will be directed to the question form. And with that, please help me welcome Assistant Secretary Brett Holmgren.
Suzanne, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for your many years of public service. And to my good friend, Glenn Gerstel, thank you for helping to organize this event. And the truth is, for those of you who know Glenn, he's the real expert on these issues. He ought to be the one you're hearing from today, but I will do my best. I also want to thank CSIS for hosting today's event. And for decades, CSIS has been at the forefront of providing cutting-edge research and solutions to some of the most complex and consequential policy issues of our time. And they conduct their work in an objective, nonpartisan manner that resonates with those of us in the intelligence community who are guided and share these same principles. So it's only fitting that today's discussion is taking place at CSIS, and it's an honor to be here. Since the founding of our republic, intelligence has advanced American interests in the world. During the Revolutionary War, General George Washington relied on intelligence to inform battlefield maneuvers and strategy. During the Civil War, Union forces established the first organization to produce formal intelligence assessments. And in World War II, the legendary Bill Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, established the Research and Analysis Branch, the predecessor to the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, or INR, to identify vulnerabilities of the Axis powers. For 77 years, INR, the organization that I'm proud to lead, has been able to carry on the legacy of providing U.S. diplomats with strategic insights because we are able to rely on access to intelligence collected and produced by other agencies. Like many of the 18 U.S. intelligence agencies, INR is a consumer, not a producer or a collector of intelligence. But today, INR and the State Department that we serve is at risk of losing access to one of the most important streams of intelligence on which we rely if Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is not renewed. As you know, this law will expire on December 31st unless Congress takes action to reauthorize it. My colleagues in the intelligence community and at the Department of Justice have already made a strong case for reauthorizing Section 702 to protect the United States from foreign threats, from terrorists and cyber attacks to espionage and weapons of mass destruction. I share these sentiments. 702 has been vital to countering these and other national security threats. But I worry the public discussion on 702 thus far has not fully addressed how 702 enables other instruments of U.S. power, including diplomacy. Simply put, the 702 program doesn't just help defend and protect U.S. interests, it is essential to advancing and promoting U.S. interests in the world. So today, I want to discuss the value of 702 to INR and the State Department, provide examples of how 702 information has enabled U.S. diplomacy, and describe the safeguards we have in place to protect privacy and civil liberties. Now, before describing how Section 702 supports U.S. diplomacy, it's important to clarify what Section 702 does and does not permit. So first, 702 is focused solely on foreign threats. It allows designated elements of the intelligence community to compel U.S. electronic communication service providers to share the data of non-U.S. persons located outside the United States who have defined types of foreign intelligence information. Second, 702 does not permit the targeting of U.S. persons or anyone located in the United States. It also prohibits so-called reverse targeting, meaning the IC cannot target the communications of a non-U.S. person abroad if the ultimate purpose is to collect on a U.S. person or someone located in the United States. Now, while 702 explicitly prohibits targeting U.S. persons, like many other forms of intelligence collection, the IC does at times obtain the communications of U.S. persons incidentally while collecting against a foreign target. In INR, when a U.S. person's data appears in an intelligence report that we receive, this can happen when foreign targets communicate with or about Americans. That data is masked in the report to protect the individual's privacy. As a consumer of intelligence reporting, INR does not have access to the raw underlying intelligence. If an INR officer needs to request the identity of that U.S. person, there's a compliance process we follow to demonstrate and document a valid need to know. And the overall number of unmasked U.S. persons are provided to the public annually as part of the DNI's annual statistical transparency report. Third, 702 is not a bulk collection program. It's a targeted, tailored collection program focused on individual foreign targets located outside the United States who are communicating about specific topics that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court has reviewed and approved. So I do hope that this provides some context for the scope of the 702 program. Throughout my career in national security, whether at the CIA, the Pentagon, or the White House, I've had a firsthand perspective on how Section 702 supports the intelligence community, the warfighter, and the policymaker. But I admit, until joining the State Department about 20 months ago, I was unaware of the critical role that 702 plays in supporting U.S. foreign policy. So let me share a few observations that underscore the importance of 702 for the State Department. In INR, it is hard to overstate the centrality of 702 collection to providing the Secretary of State and U.S. diplomats with objective, timely intelligence analysis and information. From assessments on Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea to foreign influence and cyber threats, 702 reporting provides our analysts with unique insights that, when combined with other sources of information, make our policymakers better informed about the issues so they can make better decisions. In 2022 alone, a large percentage of INR's finished analytic products included 702 reporting. Oftentimes, 702 data was the most valuable source underpinning these assessments. As one of my managers put it, INR would not be able to fulfill its mandate to use intelligence to empower diplomacy without 702-derived reporting. Another way that INR and the State Department have benefited from 702 is by sharing downgraded or declassified intelligence with allies and partners, a critical tool to strengthen U.S. leverage at the negotiating table, expose disinformation, or galvanize partners and allies. U.S. diplomats abroad routinely rely on 702 data for formal démarches, to pass threat information, or to engage counterparts on sensitive matters. Last year, many of the requests by U.S. diplomats that INR processed to downgrade or declassify intelligence for sharing with foreign partners was sourced to 702 information. Finally, Section 702 has helped the State Department monitor and evaluate Russian atrocities in Ukraine and take actions to hold them accountable. As the Deputy Attorney General testified last month, Section 702 has helped uncover gruesome atrocities committed by Russia in Ukraine, including the murder of non-combatants, the forced relocation of children from Russian-occupied Ukraine to the Russian Federation, as well as the detention of refugees fleeing violence by Russian personnel. This and other information have helped the U.S. government to galvanize accountability efforts related to Ukraine by confidently and accurately speaking to the American people and the international community about Russia's atrocities. So whether it's providing U.S. diplomats with strategic intelligence assessments, downgrading or declassifying intelligence to share with foreign partners, or taking action against those who commit atrocities, 702 is invaluable to the Department's diplomatic efforts. While I hope this general overview is useful, those of us in national security also understand that to preserve the tool, the government must do a better job demonstrating its value to the Congress and the American people. And that's why we've worked closely with our IC counterparts in recent weeks to declassify new, real-world examples that I'm pleased to share with you today. Let me start with an example regarding treaty monitoring and compliance. Without 702 collection, the State Department's ability to hold nations accountable for adhering to international obligations regarding weapons of mass destruction would be significantly degraded. For example, 702 information was a critical input and provided some of the most meaningful reporting in the classified portion of the 2023 annual report on compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention. When it comes to defending human rights, which President Biden has called a fundamental challenge of our time, Section 702 has helped the State Department shine a light on those who seek to silence dissent and opposition. In 2021, information derived from Section 702 enabled U.S. diplomats to démarche a Middle Eastern country over its efforts to monitor and track dissidents abroad, as well as dissidents right here in the United States. In another example, Section 702 data helped expose efforts by foreign powers, including the PRC, to coerce nations to oppose international responses to human rights violations. This reporting enabled U.S. diplomats to assist countries in shielding themselves from coercion and influence from these actors. And finally, 702 reporting has allowed the State Department and other agencies to notify partners and allies about illicit North Korean activities. In 2022, Section 702 data was vital in enabling us to warn the international community, the private sector, and the public about efforts by the DPRK to deploy information technology workers to commit fraud against a global industry, including against U.S. businesses, to generate revenue for its nuclear program. So in sum, 702 has been a key enabler for U.S. diplomacy. Here's the thing. America's diplomats are not going to stop engaging with the world if they lose access to a key stream of intelligence like 702. They'll continue advocating for U.S. interests, serving American citizens abroad, and working to build a more free, prosperous, and secure world. But make no mistake, a future without 702 or a much diminished 702 program will have significant costs for U.S. diplomacy. Now, having said all that, we appreciate the power and potential for abuse of 702 authorities without proper safeguards and controls. Critics are right to question whether the program has the appropriate oversight and privacy measures in place given mistakes in the past. Effective oversight by Congress and questions from civil liberties advocates have helped highlight the need for many of the recent reforms undertaken by DOJ and the IC. Now, as I said at the outset, the State Department is only a consumer of intelligence derived from 702 collection, and so my colleagues at DOJ and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence are best placed to address potential reforms to the program. However, I do want to describe the State Department's own internal safeguards and compliance measures. And here it is worth expanding on INAR's role as a consumer of 702 information, since many IC agencies, in fact, occupy a similar role. As an agency without any operational authorities tied to the 702 program, INAR, as I said before, does not have access to unevaluated, raw, or unminimized 702 data, period. Moreover, since we can't access the data, we can't perform targeted queries on it. INR and most agencies are not just prohibited from accessing raw 702-derived data, the actual email exchanges, call transcripts, chat records, etc. We don't have the capabilities to access it even if we wanted to. In fact, only authorized and trained personnel at a small number of agencies, the National Security Agency, CIA, FBI, the National Counterterrorism Agency, have access to subsets of 702 data. Instead, at INR, our officers only receive access to disseminated, serialized reporting that contains 702 data. So what does disseminated reporting refer to? It means the raw data has been reviewed for valid intelligence information by authorized personnel at the collection agency, sanitized of U.S. person information, and then formally published in a report that's made available to the broader intelligence community who are cleared for that information. Once the report is published, oftentimes by the NSA, INR analysts can then use it to inform their own strategic assessments or to support policymakers. Like other agencies, INR nevertheless has a robust internal compliance and oversight mechanism for intelligence programs like 702. First, we have Department of State guidelines for intelligence activities approved by the Attorney General, which, among other things, govern how INR retains and uses any information concerning U.S. persons. Second, we have established internal processes and procedures for INR analysts to submit requests to unmask the identity of a U.S. person in a report derived from 702 data if the analyst can demonstrate a valid need to know. For example, if a named U.S. person State Department employee in a 702 report is the target of a physical threat, an INR analyst may request to unmask the person's identity so the Bureau of Diplomatic Security can take appropriate action to protect their safety. All such requests are formally documented, reviewed, and approved by senior officials. Third, we have a Civil Liberties, Privacy, and Transparency Officer who helps oversee and advise on internal compliance with these activities. And finally, like other agencies in the intelligence community, INR is working to implement the enhanced privacy and civil liberties safeguards for U.S. signals intelligence activities that President Biden directed last year as part of Executive Order 14086 to implement the European Union U.S. data privacy framework. The reality is that, taken together, the compliance and reporting requirements for the 702 program and the improved safeguards for signals intelligence activities in the executive order represent an oversight and compliance regime that is unmatched in the world in terms of the protection and transparency that it affords U.S. citizens and non-U.S. citizens alike. At a time when digital authoritarianism is on the rise, the framework and safeguards established by the United States can serve as a model for how to conduct legitimate intelligence activities in a manner consistent with privacy, civil liberties, and transparency imperatives. Now, looking ahead, I am confident that working with Congress, we will find a way to preserve these vital authorities while addressing legitimate privacy and oversight concerns. As the Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General have said, the administration is committed to working with and engaging Congress on potential improvements to the authority that fully preserve its efficacy. For INR and the State Department, an indispensable part of that efficacy is the advantage that 702 information provides for American diplomacy. From advancing human rights and climate security to countering authoritarianism, American diplomats are on the front lines of every major threat and opportunity that we face in the world. But to sustain their efforts, to give our diplomats information advantage, they will continue to need every tool at our disposal, especially Section 702 information. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that really terrific overview and getting into some detail on a bunch of things. I think I'd like to, I'm sure we could spend a lot more time getting into detail on some of these, but we have only a little less than about 40 minutes or so. So what we'll do is I'll chat with you about some of the points you raised and go into some greater detail on them. And then we'll take some audience questions both here in the room as well as online. So where to start? You know, actually, before we dig into 702, can I take a step back and just talk a little bit about INR, which you mentioned it's what, 77 years old or so?
77 years.
So that must make it one of the oldest elements of the IC, I suspect, if not the oldest.
The oldest civilian intelligence agency.
Right, exactly. So, you know, your INR and the agency I used to work for, NSA, both share a common root in some way, going back to actually to World War I and the Cipher Bureau, which was an entity funded by the State Department and then the U.S. Army, Department of the Army, which tried to help inform America during World War I and its immediate aftermath, and then was famously shut down by Secretary of State Stimson, who, as you know, said, gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's emails, or mails, not emails, mails, right, at that time. We shouldn't read other person's mail. He changed his mind around World War II and became an advocate for a certain type of surveillance on behalf of the national security, but there is that connection. So how does INR trace its roots to that? What led to it? Can you tell us a little more about, you touched on it, but a little bit more about how the Bureau operates within the State Department itself? It's funded just by the department itself, not the IC itself, correct? But you have sort of a dotted line to the intelligence community?
Correct. So look, the history of INR, as you mentioned, dates back to World War II. And it was the research and analysis branch of the Office of Strategic Services, which was comprised of a bunch of social scientists who were experts on the cultures, the language, the histories of the nations that we were engaged with in World War II. And they were provided access to all sources of information to help identify strategic vulnerabilities of these Axis powers. And in 1945, OSS was disbanded. The CIA was one of the creations. U.S. Special Operations Command, as it's now known, was the other. And then the Bureau of Intelligence Research, INR, our predecessor, was kind of the third entity. And, President Truman, I think, recognized the value of keeping an intelligence function in the State Department to make sure that we could provide diplomats with the latest information they need to help inform foreign policy choices and decisions. And for 77 years, that's what INR has done. We've relied on really deep expertise on the issues to provide strategic assessments to support our diplomats both at home and abroad. You are right. Now, today, we are both a bureau in the State Department and one of the 18 intelligence agencies. And that means I have the benefit of and the advantage of reporting jointly to the Secretary of State and to the DNI. But we take our priorities, similar to other agencies. First and foremost, the National Intelligence Priority Framework, which is established for the entire intelligence community.
Can I interrupt you on that?
Yeah, please.
Is that something that you contribute to, or does the state have its own intelligence priorities, or you're subsumed under the broader executive branch's approach to the overall intelligence priorities? How does that sort out?
We have our own internal management priorities, but when it comes to the strategic issues that we will provide assessments on or support our policymakers on, those are all derived from the National Intelligence Priority Framework, which is established, by the DNI to serve the entire, executive branch. But we also then take into consideration, in terms of forming our own priorities, the national security strategy of the administration, and then the priorities of the Secretary of State. So in this case, Secretary Blinken's modernization agenda. Those are really the three key inputs that allow us to determine what are we going to focus on substantively, and then what are we going to focus on from a business perspective in terms of driving management reforms in the Bureau.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned oversight. Is oversight undertaken by Congress through the Foreign Relations Committees, or do you also have a sort of dotted line to the intelligence committees on the Hill?
Yeah, so I have the pleasure of being overseen by both our Foreign Relations and our intelligence committees. Okay. And it has been, we've had really great interactions and engagements with both of those, and they have both of the committees and are very kind of focused on intelligence issues and the role that INR plays both in supporting the department and in supporting the intelligence community.
Okay. Yeah. And then one more sort of personal question before we dig more into 702. How'd you wind up heading this fabulous bureau? And you obviously had a rich background in intelligence, et cetera, but is this something you had aspired to, sort of came a bit serendipitously or whatever? And then maybe if you could share a little bit about what was it like to walk into this bureau where the prior administration, without making a political point, had a very different approach to things, and you're obviously having a different agenda, different approach, different management style from the prior administration. Any light you want to shed on that? Sure.
So I had, in my career, when I was at CIA, I had worked very closely with INR substantively as an analyst, and then as a policymaker at the White House, I was the consumer of reports that INR would publish and engaged frequently with INR. And I always had a tremendous amount of respect for their expertise on the issues and for the people who work there. But I never imagined I'd have an opportunity to lead what is truly a historic, kind of iconic institution, right? But when I received the call in early of 2021, asking if I would be interested, it was probably the easiest career decision I've ever made. The ability to work on the most interesting issues in the world. Secondly, for me, I've returned to my roots in the intelligence community. I started in the IC, and so after many years later, I now had an opportunity to go back. And then finally, the people, both in INR with whom I'd worked previously, but also to serve with and for DNI Haynes and Secretary Blinken, two people for whom I have always had a tremendous amount of personal and professional respect. It was an easy decision to say, yes, I will proceed with being considered for the role.
And when you walked in, what did you find?
I walked in, after took me a little while to get confirmed. It wasn't until September of 21. There were some delays on the Hill, but nevertheless, I was excited to be confirmed in September. And look, we were still in the midst of COVID, but to my surprise, I found, an institution in INR that had largely survived mostly unscathed of some of the other, I think, impacts that other bureaus in the department suffered over the last 4 years. And but having said that, I mean, in the midst of COVID, plus just the hangover of some of the experiences of the prior 4 years, we had a need to, I think, revitalize some of the processes that are so important to making good intelligence and supporting
Have you increased
policy.
staff, or at the same level?
We've increased staff a little bit, and I think the main things we've done is really tried to focus on. This is a message that Secretary Blinken has, kind of implored upon all of his senior team, which is think about ways that you can leave the department a little bit better than when you found it. And so I've chosen to invest a lot of our time internally on building on a really strong institution in INR, but that includes modernizing how we do intelligence support to diplomacy. We've rolled out new product lines. We've got a new product daily brief for the Secretary of State that's in his book every morning. And then investing in our digital transformation, investing in cybersecurity, and investing in our people, both to increase the diversity of the type of people and the backgrounds that we're recruiting, but also the experiences they've had and the expertise they have. And so I think it's been a really fun part of the job, is helping to make a really extraordinary bureau even better.
Sure. All right, so let's get into a little more 702. So you've talked a little bit about some of the procedures. You just mentioned there's this new daily briefing book. I presume the Secretary of State gets a version of the PDB, of some sort of the President's daily brief, which, as the administration has just recently said, has a very, very significant part of it traced back to 702. So you said your bureau gets finished reports from, let's just say, NSA on Section 702, derived from Section 702. Do you enrich that yourself with your own diplomatic sources? Because obviously there's both, not only obviously the covert piece, but there's a pure overt collection, because diplomats around the world have as their function the collection of information in a very beneficial way, not surreptitiously, whatever, but they're reporting back to Washington. That is a function of one of our embassies. So how does that information that is coming in from all these embassies get into your bureau and get synthesized with the classified piece that's coming from 702? How do you package that and get that out to policymakers?
Sure. So INR is one of the three all-source analysis agencies in the intelligence community, along with CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency. And so what that means is we are reviewing all sources of information. So 702 information, imagery, human intelligence, diplomatic reporting, open sources, a lot of open sources increasingly. And we're synthesizing that, and our analysts are poring over all of that data to make conclusions about what's happening in the world, what opportunities there may be, what risks there are for the United States. And they're packaging that into a formal intelligence product, some of our products go into the President's daily brief. So they're included not only in the Secretary's book every morning, but the President's book every morning. Some of them are bespoke analytic products that we create just for the Secretary. So for instance, he's overseas right now, but before he's departing on a foreign trip, we will do tailored products that provide him background in the countries he's visiting, people he's meeting with, issues that may come up, et cetera. So we'll provide things that are just for him. He's our President and Secretary are top two clients.
Right.
So he's got his own little tailored intel service here. But then also we will use 702 information, as I said in the remarks, for beyond the analytics side of things. Diplomats overseas may come in with a request to say, look, we saw this in finished NSA reporting. Be very helpful if we could try to get that information downgraded to demarche a particular country over a policy difference we have, or an egregious violation of some human rights that we need to stand up for. INR will work with our diplomats, will work with our policy clients in the State Department to facilitate, through the appropriate channels with the intelligence community, requests to downgrade or, in some cases, to declassify 702 information to support a diplomatic engagement.
So in addition to this process of enriching information itself, do you also serve as a little bit of as a coordinator switchboard for the department or traffic cop for information coming from embassies? So it's entirely possible that an embassy may get a direct report from NSA directly, And if they want to do an unmasking to find out more information about, let us say, a U.S. person who's named there, who's a target of a foreign operation or whatever, is that a request that would come through you? Could they go directly? How do you get involved in knowing what other recipients of information are doing? Is there some coordination function or whatever?
In INR, we have an office whose the policy sharing and coordination office, whose sole purpose is to be a service provider for the rest of the department to facilitate requests with, in this case, NSA for 702 information, to downgrade or to declassify that reporting so that diplomats can use it. So in that case, if there's something that comes in, there's a formal process they go through. There's a form they have to fill out. There has to be valid need to know. It's got to be reviewed and approved. Then it goes to the intelligence community. It goes to the NSA. They're the ones ultimately have to make the decision about risk to sources and methods.
Right.
They either approve it as written, or they'll oftentimes come back with modifications to say, yes, but only with these significant edits to your text, so it doesn't reveal sourcing. And then we will provide that back to our diplomatic customers, if you will, so that they can use it in their engagement. And that's hundreds of times a year
Right.
we facilitate those requests.
And if one of the embassies said, we'd like to get more intelligence on a particular point that's relevant to our host country and learn more about it, would that request come to you, and then you could present that to the IC to learn more information, or?
Sure. And oftentimes that is what.
So that might lead to targeting decisions by NSA at some point down the road. So
it could. Usually, it depends on the urgency of the matter, and if it's a really urgent issue, yes, we will. That will come in through us. We will help address those what they call collection requirements with the reporting agency. If it's 702 information, we'll help address that with NSA. Or if it's more kind of general, strategic in nature, hey, we'd really like to know more about these topics in the future. It's helping to support.
Right.
A public diplomacy effort that we're doing in the field, we'll feed that into the National Intelligence Priority Framework, that overall kind of intelligence collection process that you mentioned up front.
Right. And what about sharing with allies and friends? Obviously, 702 information is vitally important to the U.S., but also is potentially relevant to some of our allies, and obviously we have an important relationship with the Five Eyes. Can you talk about intelligence sharing, and I assume that must be coordinated through INR as opposed to other elements of the department? Yeah.
It is a similar process. Again, if there are requests from the field to share that information, it will go through us. We will help facilitate the request, get it downgraded, declassified. But I'd say one of the ways, at least in INR, that we will regularly use 702 information and share with partners and allies, even if our partners and allies don't always know that that information is derived from 702, is through analytic exchanges that we have with a range of foreign partners in support of intelligence diplomacy. There are a number of engagements that I've had over the last year with our European Union counterparts on Russia and Ukraine and PRC issues, et cetera, that some of the kind of talking points and substantive analysis is derived from some of that 702 reporting. That's useful because it gives our partners and allies an opportunity to respond to our own assessments,
Right.
help us identify blind spots in our analysis, understand what they're worried about, what they're not. So it's very useful. Downgrading to classifying in general is useful.
Sure.
702 is a big part of that in terms of the work that we do.
I imagine some of that must have been very relevant during the beginning of and during the course of the Ukraine conflict,
Sure.
which you mentioned during your remarks. Can you tell us a little more about the process of declassifying and how you alluded to an example of how 702 has been relevant in the Ukraine context? Could you elaborate on that? And also, do you want to share any further classified details if we promise not to tell anybody? Or?
I'll pass on that.
Okay,
Thank you for that opportunity. Look, in the run-up, obviously, to Russia's further
Some questions. Good.
invasion of Ukraine, intelligence in general, as everyone saw, was critically important to help galvanize partners and allies, expose Russian disinformation, and ultimately, importantly, to warn the Ukrainians about the impending assault. So 702 is a part of that. I won't get into the details. That was obviously a source of it. But then, as I mentioned in my remarks, one of the ways 702 has been very useful I referenced the statement from the Deputy Attorney General recently about how the government in general, but I know the State Department in particular, has used it for accountability purposes in terms of the atrocities that Russian actors have committed in the context of Ukraine. So that'll be, it's important now, it'll be more important for accountability mechanisms in the future.
Okay. And then you also alluded to European views on Section 702. So, of course, here in the United States, most of the debate thus far, which you also commented on, about concerns over Section 702 have been principally around the use of the authority by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and its ability to query incidental collection, et cetera. You mentioned that. So that's been the focus of most of the discussion here. But there's also been a sort of steady drumbeat over the years on the part of principally Europeans, a little less so in Asia, about how 702 authorities are used by the United States. And of course, there was going back, the famous Schrems Facebook decision, some battles between the US and the EU over Privacy Shield, all about essentially a feeling on the part of Europeans that their data wasn't sufficiently protected from what they perceived to be inappropriate US surveillance. And there's been some tension back and forth. That's been ameliorated somewhat by a new EU-US data privacy framework, the details of which are still being worked on. You mentioned the new executive order, which I assume you had input in. Where do things stand in terms of, let's say, principally on the transatlantic side about concerns over Section 702? I know they also have some concerns over authorities under 12333, the general surveillance authorities for the United States government. Where does that stand? Could you comment on it? And in particular, do you think that'll have any effect on the ultimate decisions by Congress to renew 702? Do you think that's going to be part of an amendment package? Do you have any thoughts in that area?
So let me try to respond to that in a few different ways. Make a broad point to start with. The first is just to acknowledge that the United States government is blessed with extraordinary signals intelligence capabilities, as we know. But we also recognize that these capabilities mean that we have great responsibilities to balance the protection of civil liberties and privacy while maintaining our security interests. And we welcome that. You know, the United States has been the leader defending human dignity and personal privacy protections for people around the world for decades. So we recognize there's a special responsibility we have, and we embrace that. And there are higher standards, and we think there ought to be. And just as we are focused on striking the right balance here at home, I think we recognize that our global engagement and leadership in the world demands we do the same overseas. And so that, you know, it has in part informed. The second point I'd make is the new executive order, as you mentioned, the EU-US data privacy framework. Now, that executive order was designed to be the basis to implement, you know, the framework. But in consultation with our European colleagues and friends and partners, look, there were a number of really important protections that were included in that. I won't name all of them. You can go read through them, but a few I think are important, worth highlighting, because some of them are unprecedented. But first and foremost is that the executive order defines that for all U.S. signals intelligence activities, which are not exclusive to 702 authorities,
right,
but do include 702, they can only be conducted for specific, defined, legitimate national security objectives. I won't name all of them: counterterrorism, counterespionage, cyber, foreign interference, threats to U.S. personnel overseas, hostage-taking, transnational criminal organizations, etc. So those are the only valid objectives for which 702, but all signals intelligence activity, can be conducted pursuant to the EO. The executive order, I think, also it mandated handling requirements for agencies that collect and handle, you know, personal information collected pursuant to U.S. signals intelligence activities. And it established, and this is important, this multi-layered mechanism for individuals from qualifying states to seek redress if they believe that you know, their personal information has been collected or handled in a way in violation of U.S. law, right? And there's a whole process that they can seek redress for that. That's unprecedented.
Which has not yet been implemented.
Not yet been implemented, right.
And there's some people who've said, gee, why is it that EU citizens get a right that seemingly American citizens don't get? So,
right, and in this context, it's because signals and intelligence activities pursuant to the EO are conducted against foreign targets.
Right.
So they in the U.S. we have the Fourth Amendment. But the other thing is the executive order, it has the Privacy, Civil Liberties Oversight Board, the PCLOB, to hold the government to account.
Right.
So I think those are very important. And look, the final thing I'd say is just to refer back to what I said in the remarks, which is that, again, if you collectively you take the Executive Order 14086 plus all of the transparency and compliance and oversight requirements, the overall framework for 702, together, these are unprecedented in terms of the level of protections that are afforded to U.S. and non-U.S. citizens alike, especially for European citizens. And I think we do. I think it's a model for the future in the age of ubiquitous communications and in a rapidly evolving communications technology environment for other nations to follow in terms of how do you conduct legitimate intelligence activities, again, consistent with these transparency and privacy imperatives.
I know, good point. I think one of the things that I was having a discussion with an EU privacy advocate recently about this in Section 702 and their concerns about it, and they asked what would happen if Section 702 wasn't reauthorized by Congress, and of course the authority would lapse. But in some ways, that isn't necessarily a better outcome for the EU, because then they're left, from their viewpoint, being subject to the surveillance authorities under the Executive Order 12333, which doesn't have a lot of the safeguards and guardrails and built-in structures that 702 does. So while 702 is focused on U.S. service providers, and there's obviously a difference here because one is foreign targets who have U.S. communications elements, it does, as you say, have all sorts of protections and guardrails around it that the other surveillance, not subject to the Fourth Amendment concerns, does not have. So there's obviously a tension there, which Congress is going to have to work through. Why don't we take a couple of questions from the audience? I've got a bunch of questions here from online, which are still coming in. Let me just see if there's any questions here in the audience, and in the back there, and then this lady here in the middle. Thank you. And over there. Yep. Thank you. If you could just stand up. Okay, yeah. Those are the questions here already? Okay, oh, I didn't realize that. My mistake, I didn't realize that. Okay, well, then let's see. Okay, well, here's one that's a little technical, and then we'll get to something else, which is, I didn't realize these questions have already been written down, I'm sorry. Can you go into a little more detail about the unmasking process? What % of the time and under what circumstances are Americans' information unmasked, and is there any revelation of Americans involved in illegal activity abroad?
Look, I can speak for how the unmasking process works in INR and the State Department, and the overall numbers provided for the government are in the DNI's annual statistical transparency report. But for INR and the State Department, again, if there is an analyst comes across a piece of disseminated reporting that references a U.S. person, a U.S. entity generally, and they believe that they, as that expert, need to understand, basically unmask that identity to help either inform their analysis of a particular situation, or if it's some sort of threat scenario, whether it's a cyber threat, physical threat, espionage, et cetera, they will submit a request that's documented, goes through a process internally, multiple levels within INR. Ultimately, either myself or another senior individual are the ones that ultimately say yes or no, that can go forward to the collection agency to seek the unmasking. And then that agency ultimately makes the decision. It's either they believe it's a valid purpose that is necessary for, in this case, INR or the State Department to perform and execute its duties, where they say no, and we get a denial of a response. But it is all well documented, and there have been a number of requests that I don't reprove. But fortunately, overall it's a small percentage, because our analysts recognize that it's an extremely sensitive matter to seek these unmasking requests.
Okay, yeah, and I know that when I was at NSA, and there was some controversy over unmaskings, I certainly know that the procedures at NSA were quite rigorous, required information. And of course, the point we always made, which sort of got lost a little bit, was that the unmasking was a voluntary policy decision on the part of NSA. In this case, not every agency masks information, but because of the fact that there could be incidental collection of Americans, and the only time an American's name would be even mentioned in an intelligence report was that it was relevant to foreign intelligence, not just gratuitous information. So it had to be relevant to the report, otherwise why put it in the report? And it was a protective mechanism. And very often when I was at NSA, we'd get requests from agencies to learn the information, and there were just I can just recall a handful of times where we felt it was inappropriate. I mean, I can just recall one, and I think it would turn out to be a technical error, so to speak, it was just but substantively, I think and there's now some more regulation around it, but I think people should recognize it's fundamentally a protective device. So we've got a couple of questions that all sort of seem to do with the recent discussions about the FBI and revelations in FISA, FISC opinions, et cetera, about abuses. And I know that's not State Department's concern, but it is coloring the whole debate about about abuses undertaken by the FBI in the past. There have been some reforms, but it's now coloring the debate. And do you have any sort of comment on that? I know it's not State Department, but it is, as I said, affecting the discussion. And where do you think that's going to come out? And in particular, one of these questions is about, do you think would it hurt the State Department if the FBI had a warrant requirement associated with its queries? That's one of the questions here too.
Yeah. Look, on the FISC court opinions that you mentioned, I think I was, like a lot of us, it was disturbing and unfortunate. But the fact that those came to light was because of the reporting and the transparency requirements that have been instituted by the Director of National Intelligence. So in some respects, it shows that the oversight process is ultimately working to help expose practices that obviously need to be remediated and addressed. And I think I won't speak for the FBI, but I know in this case, a number of the non-compliant queries that were referenced in some of the recent reporting, did occur before several of the remediation measures that they put in place since then in 21 and in 2022 that would have, in any event, prevented some of these non-compliant queries in the past. Now, look, in terms of the impact it would have on the State Department if there were a requirement for, either a Title I FISA court order or a warrant. And I'll focus on the Title I FISA court order because that's generally has a lot more of the connection to the foreign intelligence side of things. Look, it is. I don't want to speculate on. Again, it's hard to kind of understand. In hypotheticals, but I would just say that anything that diminishes the amount and the value of the intelligence that we currently receive at the State Department from 702 Drive reporting, so anything that would diminish that would have a negative impact on the work of our analysts to produce their assessments and the support that we provide to our diplomats. That is just a fact. We're starting at the baseline of really valuable information we receive that is well protected with a ton of safeguards. We're consumers of it, so we want more of it because it's incredibly valuable for our folks. So anything less than that, or if the value is diminished, it is going to impact our mission.
Right. Well, two of the areas that My sense is that would be particularly susceptible to being negatively affected in this area would be cybersecurity, where the Bureau in particular has a very active role in recovering ransom payments, going after cryptocurrency, helping to locate the ransomware gangs overseas, et cetera, and that's a key function. Of course, speed is essential, as well as victim notification of domestic victims who are targets of ransomware activities. So that's one area where speed is essential, and therefore the process of getting a warrant might have an effect. But the other is an area that's also relevant to state, which is the counterintelligence function, and people going after our foreign spies, foreign agents going after our diplomats and embassy personnel, et cetera, where again, we may not have probable cause to get a warrant, but we'd want to do something about it. So I could see those two areas as being potentially ones of greater concern.
Right. Yeah, I would just say, look, State Department, we do not have any operational authorities tied to the program, and so really, the FBI, DOJ, and the Office of Director of National Intelligence, the White House are probably best placed to talk about potential reforms. But I would just point back to what the DNI and the Attorney General said earlier this year, which is that the administration's open to potential improvements to the program that preserve the efficacy. And again, for us at the State Department, that is the key point is, look, Congress has an incredibly important role to play here in overseeing this program. And let's just go back in history a little bit, right? 1978, the whole beginning of FISA grew out of congressional investigations and of intelligence community abuses and the Church Pike Committee.
Hearings, right?
So that is why this whole architecture was established in the first place. And so it's incredibly important. The administration believes oversight's important. Congress is ultimately going to have to get comfortable with reporting and oversight controls that give them confidence that the program is operating as intended in compliance with the law. And our ask is that we preserve those really important capabilities to continue to generate the intelligence, the foreign intelligence derived from this program.
So that's a good point to end on. We're coming up to the end of the hour, and I got one question which is just follows on to your last point, which is, given what you just said, how is INR and state going to be involved in the discussions with Congress on the reauthorization? Obviously, the IC that's being led by both the White House and the ODNI, Director Haynes, but how are you and state going to get involved in that, in the final discussions there? You're making the points you just presumably made. But,
yeah. So look, we've taken a step today where we're trying to share more real-world examples, declassified examples of how 702 information supports diplomacy. There are some that, as hard as we push, it's going to be difficult to get some of these examples declassified because ultimately we do not want to jeopardize some really valuable sources. So behind closed doors with the Congress, we'll provide more classified examples to them at their request and as needed. And publicly, we'll continue to articulate to the Congress and the American people, again, the value and the importance of this program to supporting U.S. foreign policy.
Good. A good point to end on. Suzanne, I don't know if you want to close us out, but let me just say thank you, and I know Suzanne's going to thank you as well, but This has really been very informative.
Outstanding. Great discussion, Glenn. Thank you very much for doing such a great job moderating. Assistant Secretary, thank you for your candor today and for helping all of us better understand the broader context in which this really important debate takes place. So really grateful for your time, and would you please join me in thanking.
Thank you. Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate it. Thank you.